Welcome to Fool's Gold. I'm Cara Cordoni. In a world where everyone sells sparkles, how can we tell glitter from gold? Join me in exploring discernment in the Age of Grift. Views and opinions expressed on Fool's Gold do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast, its host, or its producers. Any content provided by our guests, contributors, or authors represents their own opinions and experiences and is not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, or entity. Hello, welcome to Fool's Gold, Discernment in the Age of Grift. I am your host, Cara Cordoni, and I am joined today with Jon Atack. And we are going to talk about some of the origins of much of what we take for granted as the New Age ideas, the New Age frames, because a lot of them have origins that nobody talks about. And Jon has been investigating, writing about, deconstructing, educating for many years now based on his direct participation as a Scientologist. So, yeah, would you like to introduce yourself, Jon?
Sure, yeah. It's actually 42 years ago that I left Scientology. I was a customer of Scientology, what they call public. So I was very lucky. I think I'm the only person I know of more than 1,000 who was not humiliated and abused while in Scientology, because I was an artist, a writer, a musician, and even though I wasn't earning any money, under Hubbard's policy, I had to be treated with kid gloves as a celebrity. And so I had 9 years of going up the bridge to total freedom. I achieved the high level of operating Thetan 5, Section 5, which at the time, there are only 8 now. So it was 25 of the 28 levels I did. These are the ones where you get the superpowers, which was great fun. I still have people who contact me from my show and they say, yeah, but how do you get exterior from your body? Or how do you do that? I had this guy contact me last week and he said, well, we didn't get clear. So how do you do that? And it's like, well, he made it up. It's not in fact true. So anyway, I was 9 years a customer. I left because I thought that Scientology was being taken over by malign forces. I didn't realize it had always been a malign force. And I helped to seed the independent movement of Scientology back in 1983. And a few weeks after leaving, this chap came along and dumped this pile of 18-inch stack of documents on my desk and said, I don't have time to read all of this. You'd probably have you're the sort of person who'd like, he was from New Zealand, whatever. and I've been told that it's okay to impersonate Strine accents because they think it's funny, whereas we have to be a bit more careful about some of the other ones. But a lovely guy, a guy called John Hanson, and he dumped this pile of material, and this was stuff that had been gathered by a journalist called Michael Lynn Shannon. And it absolutely showed that all of the claims that Hubbard had made about studying with gurus in India, China, Tibet, and Mongolia were completely fake. He'd had a couple of holidays as a teenager in China. I would later actually get his handwritten journals as part of my research of those 2 trips. And in one of them, he does indeed mention a lamasery, and he says the monks' voices sounded like bullfrogs. And that's the only comment, and it is profound, about his studies with gurus in the East. He claimed to be a nuclear physicist. He never studied nuclear physics. He was thrown out of George Washington University, having failed, of course, in atomic and molecular physics, not nuclear at all. He claimed to be an explorer, nonsense, and he claimed to be a wounded war hero. Now, as soon as he died in 1986, I got hold of his war records, all 800 pages of them. And I went through them with somebody else who served at the same time that he did during World War II. And it was clear he never saw action. His wounds, and originally in 1950, there's an article, an interview with him where he talks about falling down a ship's ladder.
Right.
and being blinded by the flash of a ship's gun, and having conjunctivitis, pink eye, he calls it, and something wrong with his feet. Those are the words he used. Those were his war wounds. Now, he cured these by developing Dianetics. When he lost the trademark to Dianetics, he renamed it Scientology. Then he got Dianetics back, and on it went. So I spent years talking with people who'd come out of Scientology, pretty badly damaged, many of them. Families had been broken up, inheritances had been squandered. I met somebody
Right.
who'd given 3 inheritances to them and died in poverty.
Mm.
Um, and, you know, it's a very invasive system where something like transcendental meditation has 2 techniques, both of them deeply questionable, frankly. Scientology has 2,000.
No.
And he pulled together he used hypnotic manuals. I traced down everything he'd referenced. He used the work of Aleister Crowley. That was the main stem from which he drew. And he reframed it, he reworded it so that where Crowley would talk about thelema, the use of the will to make people comply with you, Hubbard said intention. And so the idea of Scientology is that your intention will become so good that you can make people do whatever you want, whether they like it or not. I didn't see it quite that way. I thought it was a force for good. And the other thing is this idea that you'll be able to leave your body and travel around the universe at will. So I wrote still the only history of Scientology, which I have here, oddly enough. Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky. That was used by a journalist called Russell Miller, who I work for as well, for his biography of Hubbard, Barefaced Messiah, a great title, which is an excellent book. I mean, certainly for anybody coming out of Scientology, it absolutely is necessary to understand the history of your group and the biography of the founder. You can't understand what happened to you without understanding those things. So I spent years helping people, I worked with about 600 ex-members face-to-face over the years. I then helped to set up the Open Minds Foundation about 10 years ago, which is still running. I'm doing other things, and wrote this book, Opening Our Minds, which covers really the basic methods that are used by all authoritarian groups.
That book is so helpful, and the systematic breakdown, it made it really easy to parse, because I think, we're so emotional and we have our projections and the lies, and there's a way, that you lay it out that allowed me to, I guess, deal with reality. Like, oh, these are the behaviors, these are the characteristics, and sort it out for me, around particular characters. So yeah, I think it's really important for all of us that we come out of cults, and I see how I didn't necessarily do it. I see other people coming out, which is, it's like, oh yeah, that was a bad group, it's a cult. And that's like an end point, when really that's a beginning point, because then it's like, oh, I need to deconstruct what that experience has done to me. What is my identity now? What have I absorbed that I need to want to get out of my system? And like you said, if you don't look at who designed the system, what were the inputs into that person, and then what they cast, then a little bit like you did, I'm particularly breaking down my experience with the International School of Temple Arts, much smaller organization, than Scientology and its scope and breadth, but still in the bones, using these same techniques and pieces. And when I didn't go deeply into, okay, this is who cast the die, so to speak, we also tried to reform it. We were like, oh, let's
As I did.
fix. Right. And so many good people do. And many people go in thinking, oh, I see what needs to be fixed. I'll gain some power. I'll learn. I'll rise in the ranks and I'll fix it. And that's not what actually happens. Like, it's not broken. And so you're not going to fix it because it's not broken. Um, so yeah, I think that's really important and that's hopefully what, part of this audience are people that are familiar with ISTA, some of them, or have been through that. And there's not a lot of discussion about what are the places that, for example, Baba Dez, Robert Nichols, he started ISTA. And then he attracted these other characters, in particular Bruce Lyon, who's in New Zealand. He's a New Zealander, Kiwi.
So I
And
can impersonate his accent as well.
there you go. And he is the one who designed level 2, and he's the one that has the connection to Theosophy. He has a connection where he claims to be in the lineage of Alice Bailey and to be channeling one of the trans-Himalayan entities, Master DK, I think is his short. Is that right? Dwal, I'm going to get it wrong. Sorry, non-existent spirit.
Kumi and Mariah and all invented characters.
Dwal something. And so what's happened from my perspective, Des built a thing that served his sexual desires under the guise of healing the world through love. That attracted these other characters who were like, oh, I can build on this. And with Haydn Temple, it's become a magnet, right? It's the outer layer. You send your people in, you fish for the most vulnerable, the most that are willing to now go from a 1-week retreat to a 6-week retreat. Yeah, in New Zealand. And then they have no idea about Bruce in context. And so that's where I was like, okay, how interesting that now we're going to be able to talk about a place that both Scientology has used as a source, that this whole Bruce Haydn Temple uses, and we can even talk about, the other impacts that this woman Blavatsky, her disciple Bailey, and so on. So yeah, can you take us to quote unquote the beginning? I guess Blavatsky and the 1800s.
Well, yeah, as you've seen, I always have a book that
yeah.
Jonathan Joe has a mouth like an O and a wheelbarrow full of surprises. If you ask for a bat or something like that, he's got it, whatever the size is. So this is my latest offering. Scientology ruled the world.
Yeah, I think it's chapter 8 or so that Blavatsky, you begin to unpack the Blavatsky story in If Scientology Ruled the World.
Yeah, and I sort of circle back round to it. I had, back in 1990 when I first published A Piece of Blue Sky, I'd already traced Hubbard's direct involvement with the Crowley cult through Jack Parsons. He and Jack Parsons tried to conjure the Antichrist in ceremonies in January and March of 1946. So that was the origin of Scientology. He launches Dianetics 3 years later. And along the way, I found the court documents where Jack Parsons, the Crowleyite disciple, had tried to, in fact, had successfully sued Hubbard for stealing all his money, and he never did get it back. But so I knew that it came from Crowley, and I'd looked into Crowley. Even in 1984, I interviewed John Simons, who was Aleister Crowley's literary executor and wrote The Great Beast, the biography of Crowley. And he was great fun. I found the recordings the other day of this, and he's like, he was an awful man. And he knew I hated him, but he knew I'd do the job. And so, so I've written about that, but there'd been this thing that had been bothering me for a long time, which was the involvement of certain Nazis with the occult. And there's a lot of nonsense. Pauls and Bergier, The Morning of the Magicians, they wrote 2 other bestsellers after that. Spear of Destiny by Ravenscroft. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. So you can't tell what's true and what's not. Then historians like Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Professor Goodrick Clark. He was the first significant one. Michael Wood, who was making documentaries for the BBC and made some brilliant things
Right.
over this. I had the
And
great
they
pleasure
did a documentary, didn't they? Wasn't there a
on.
BBC series that on the occult origins of the Nazi?
He did something about Wewelsburg Schloss and Himmler's Round Table because he was
Right.
expecting the Knights of King Arthur to reincarnate. Now, having read the Arthurian legends along the way, of course, they're made up stories. So when they reincarnate, who knows what's going to... I even wrote a novel, and I haven't got a copy of that in front of me, damn, which I haven't published yet, actually, which is based on Parsifal, which is, the guy who found the Holy Grail, or one of the two characters in the different stories who's meant to have found it, conquered the wasteland and all of the Fisher King and all of that good stuff. But
Right.
I knew there was something there, and finally year before last now, I started work on bringing this together. And all roads led to Madame Blavatsky. So she is, in fact, a German, from an aristocratic military family. She was born in what is now Ukraine. Her grandfather had studied with Count Cagliostro, it is said. Great name among the Rosicrucians, one of the founders, and an absolute con artist of supreme degree. He spent the last decade of his life in prison with his Serafina, who had been his common law wife, with the two of them telling stories about each other to the authorities about how they'd scammed people. Still
wow.
revered in circles around the Masons and the Rosicrucians. But so her grandfather had actually met this guy, had this huge library of material. He was a prince, and she, from quite early childhood, started reading this stuff. By the time she was 17 and got married, she absorbed so much of this literature. Whichever way we go about it, one of her
Right.
biographers said she was probably the most learned, if not the wisest woman of the
Yes.
19th century. And she could quote whole pages of material from memory. She seems to have had an
Wow.
autistic memory. And she traveled through Turkey. She traveled and said that she studied with Sufis. She had absorbed the secrets of the Sufi, of the Masonic, of the Rosicrucian orders. She claimed she'd gone to Tibet. I think that's a lie.
Right.
It's very unlikely at that time in
It
the
would have
19th
been
century.
incredibly unlikely.
Yeah. I mean, Alexander David Neal did go there and spend decades there in the 20th century, but her accounts are good and we can
Right.
believe them. Blavatsky
And
then,
Blavatsky was born 1829. When was she born?
she's born
Or
in
around
18, being here somewhere. I think it's about 1830, and she dies in 1891,
181. Okay.
around there. So
Yeah.
in the 1850s, she receives a message from one of her gurus, one of the people she's channeling, that she has to go to the US and she has to trick the spiritualists into promoting her. And she admits that she was tricking them. And so she meets people around the Fox sisters. One of the pair actually, of course, later completely admitted how they were
Right.
performing the con.
And these were the Fox sisters were holding seances, and they were receiving messages from the dead. So they were connecting with, people's past loved ones. And they used, it was a method of popping sounds. I mean, ultimately, we find out that they could crack their toes and crack other joints
Yes.
to create this phenomenon.
Mm.
And like you said, one of the sisters came forward, but there was so much interest at the time that this literally started the spiritualist movement. Like this, they are the seed of that. And then that was part of the burnt over, I think, was like a term where all this area where the spiritualist fire took root here in America on the East Coast.
Yeah, I mean, it was massive, and so much so that it influenced our whole culture. So that if you talk to somebody, if you go and watch Ghostbusters or talk to somebody about ghosts, the
Yeah.
descriptions they will give are actually things that didn't exist prior to the late 1840s, because in Christian theology, and from St. Augustine onward, the only malevolent spirits can be communicated with. That is Orthodox Christian belief. So the idea that you could communicate with your dead loved ones was a blasphemy. It was a heretical view. And it's now become part of the culture as if it has always been this way, as if people have always believed this. If we take the term New Age, it was first being used at the end of the 19th century, the new eon that was, the awning of the cage of aquariums was about to descend more than a century ago. And there were all sorts of prophecies and predictions. I mean, one of the side issues for me was, which I'd started to write this book about, but I had to put it aside, was the book of Revelation and the baleful influence that has come from people not realizing it says what it's about. It's about the Neronic persecution of Christians in 64 AD. It's very exact. It's within the text. You can see it. And so many people, starting with Joachim of Fiore in, I think, 1178, since then, every generation has had some catastrophe like the Iraq wars that were massively influenced by interpretations of the book of Revelation as if it were prophetic. It was never meant to be prophetic. What's more, it probably shouldn't be in the New Testament because it was mistakenly attributed to John the Apostle rather than John of Patmos. And Bart Ehrman, he wrote a book about it, which is, as with all of his work, is absolutely wonderful in deconstructing this. But these ideas come in, and it's as if they've been there forever. So the contemporary gurus, so many of them are actually using ideas that derive from Blavatsky. For example, the idea of the Aryan race, which the Nazis, Himmler, Heydrich, and many of the senior Nazis actually believed this nonsense, that there was a distinct genetic people. And what people don't necessarily know is they felt that this had been corrupted through interbreeding, through miscegenation, and that the original Aryans had superpowers. They had the kind of powers that L. Ron Hubbard and others are trying to sell to people. And Himmler got very serious about this and started the Lebensborn. And these were places where SS officers who had blue eyes and blonde hair would have sex with captive enslaved women, for the most part, who had blonde hair and blue eyes, and they would have children. We know that there were at least 8,000 children born. The most famous of them, Frida in ABBA, the band ABBA. She's a Lebensborn child, born in Norway but grew up in Sweden. There may have been as many as 20,000. And the idea was they were going to breed electron powers, these superpowers into them. Now, these ideas come out of Blavatsky, and she would have been horrified. She was a socialist. She was also a woman, which was not something the Nazis were very appreciative of. But she wasn't. She basically was anti-Semitic, but her anti-Semitism was the idea that Jews would evolve through reincarnation to become Aryans, and then.
So she wasn't exactly a eugenicist. She was a racist, or she was anti-Semitic. But then it was the furthering of her ideas that turned it into eugenics. Is that fair?
Okay. It is. And of course, eugenics was something, again, people mistakenly associate it simply with the Nazis without understanding that its roots as a legal practice of sterilizing people are in the US. Connecticut was the first place in the 1890s. Curiously, although the word eugenics is English in origin, Sir Francis Galton coined it, there was never a eugenics policy in this country. Sweden, quite a lot of countries actually had enforced sterilization for the feeble-minded and people who were disabled. Hitler and co, of course, carried that out so that schizophrenics, people who were deaf, people who had any physical deformity were murdered or sterilized.
My grandmother, who was born in the 30s, she was in a car accident in a Model T Ford with her brother, and it broke her back when she was 13. And through many things, she ended up getting married. They told her not to get pregnant. She got pregnant in 1944, and she went, and of course they did a cesarean, and they were very disapproving. Like, they let her know the whole time that this was a big mistake and everything. They handed her my mother, her only child, and said, "Congratulations, you're a parent, but you'll never have another child. We have given you a full hysterectomy. What you've done is very um whatever." They, and it
It's
was
immoral, yeah, it's
devastating
wrong.
for her. Yeah, it was devastating, because she had been, even if I'm paralyzed, I can have a bunch of kids and helpers, and we're on the farm, and so yeah, I mean, people think it wasn't here or isn't here, or they didn't come in and study what we were doing, and they did. They came and learned from us, and then they took that home. And
Yeah, I mean, Hitler wrote a letter congratulating the US president on the eugenics policy before he took power in Germany. Um, Also, eugenics as a policy was being practiced in Germany before 1933 when Hitler came to power. It started in the 20s. I mean, one of the things that I uncovered, which shocked, I mean, there's a lot in this book that shocked me along the way. I really hadn't expected what was there, is the extent to which the Protestant churches were involved in eugenic programs. And the Catholic Church, in fact, backed away in 1930 and said, no, this is a wrong thing to do. But there were Jewish organizations in the US and Protestant organizations who were shouting very loudly about this. And of course, famous people like Bill Gates' grandfather was involved in
right,
Kellogg, the inventor of
absolutely,
cornflakes,
right,
poured most of his fortune into eugenics to purify the white race. The drug laws throughout the world are derived, which I don't get into in the book here, but they derive from eugenic policies. In Canada, when the first country to make cannabis illegal, Western country, in 1924, it was based on a novel called The Black Candle, written by a woman under the name Jenny Cannock. And she was a juvenile magistrate. And her argument was that after they've smoked cannabis, white women want to have sex with black men and they will miscegenate. They will
right,
breed. That's why it was made illegal there. 4 years later, it was made illegal in the UK. There was no other reason given. And, similarly, when you trace back the Harrison Act to 1915 in the US, it's about black people and cocaine and black
yeah,
people and the opioid with the Chinese. Most
right,
people are unaware that in 1882 the US put in place the Immigration Act prohibiting Chinese immigration to the US, and they then made opium illegal, not heroin or morphine
right,
or the more powerful derivatives, but opium, because
right,
they knew that Chinese used it as a relaxant. And then
right,
they forbade the returning of the dead from the US to China. Of course, under Chinese have to be buried where they were born. So all in an attempt to say we don't want you Chinese people here. Very bizarre period in history,
right,
which led us to all sorts of craziness. And the reality, when you look into genetics, there is absolutely no doubt now that we're all mixed out of the same origins. In fact, the differences within ethnic groups are greater than the differences between ethnic groups. We carry Denisovan, Neanderthal DNA. It's now traceable. There are no Aryans, no
right,
Lemurians, no root races. And it was very much a revolution against science on Blavatsky's part, at a
mm,
time where Charles Lyell had come along and said, you know, Bishop Ussher was wrong. The God did not create the world in 4004 BC. It's hundreds of millions of years old, judging by the striations of rock formations. And
right,
then Charlie Darwin and Alfred Wallace, and Wallace was a spiritualist. This is something, we talk about the Darwinian idea. Wallace has just been dropped, but he published at the same time as Darwin, with Darwin's agreement. And he'd actually been out in the world working while Darwin had been thinking it through while being poorly at home,
right,
poor lad. And you get people like Blavatsky, and what they're doing is they're saying, okay, we've got this fight against evolution. And she invents a different system where she says 200 to 300 million years ago, there was intelligent life on Earth, but it was amorphous. It wasn't tangible.
Right.
And they're still with us, apparently. And then that's the first root race. And then you get these other 4 root races. She's very unpleasant about the 4th root race. Various peoples are singled out as being inferior, including, say, Hottentots, as they call them then.
Yeah.
So there is terrific racism there. But
Right.
she puts forward this preposterous idea that there was a war fought for 1 million years on the Earth using dirigibles, air balloons, because, of course, the aeroplane hadn't been invented in her time. So, but 1 million-year war, and there is nothing left of it. And as I point out in Scientology Ruled the World,
Yeah.
the Civil War in this country in the 1640s, the Civil War in the 1860s in the US, just 4 years, each of them. You can still go and find the lead. You can still
Right.
find the remains of these things. So if they were blowing up these airships, there would be something. And but it was an anti-scientific crusade, to invent all this stuff. And I think that one of the things that impressed me the most, that just the simplest of ideas, and it came, I was researching some material on Carl Gustav Jung, which didn't get into the book. He was anti-Semitic too. But he was deeply into alchemy. And at the highest level of the Jungian training, when you've done all the rest, they let you into the esoteric material. And the esoteric material, he had the largest private collection of alchemical documents of anyone ever. Just an incredible library. He also wrote this thing called the Red Book, which is about his own 5 years of psychosis in the teens of the last century, where he's still treating clients.
Wow.
He's still having sex with his clients. He's still creating this bullshit thing. But I realized in watching this material, it was a 3-hour documentary, that what such people do, Hubbard or whoever else is, they go, I'll just check my imagination and see if that's true. Yes, that feels right. It's true. No
Right.
scientific evidence is not of any concern to them. They have the feeling of certainty, as William James put it, noesis, the sense of certainty. And
Right.
James founds modern psychology, also founded both the British and American Societies for Psychic Research. So it's not that he was a disbelieving skeptic. Absolutely not. But he was scientific about it. And in fact,
Right.
at the end of the investigations, and the first person to be investigated was Madame Blavatsky, and she was declared a fraud by the British Psychical Research Society, and then left India, her house having burned down with all the evidence in it. But James came to the
Oh, go ahead.
conclusion, after looking at all of the research that was being done, and some of it's fascinating. There's a brilliant book by Deborah Blum called Ghost Hunters, which is really fascinating. She's a science writer. And they were collecting evidence. Mark Twain was involved as well. They were collecting evidence. The evidence was really interesting, but James at the end said, it's not sufficient. We haven't actually proved that there is life after death or this, that, and the other. So when you come to Hubbard or Blavatsky or Aleister Crowley, they just talk to the imp that lives on their shoulder, or just some psychotic fantasy that they then say, well, this is real because I believe it is real.
And you can convince people of it, their charisma or their will, intention, whatever. They can manipulate people into buying into their their confidence, right? I mean, and so somehow it's just so interesting with Blavatsky to me. Like, you've got this highly intelligent, right? Like, she spoke so many languages. She could
At
quote
least
all of
9.
these 9 languages. Like, wow. And she wrote, what, 2 or 3 books, Isis,
Isis
Unveiled.
Unveiled, and the What's
The
It
big
Wisdom,
one.
the
Yeah.
this isn't good. We're not looking very impressive
It
here, are
doesn't.
we?
You know what? We don't want to promote her books anyway. So, she wrote the books, and even in the research there was like evidence of so many sources, right? That she had read and understood parts of, or stole parts of. Um, so highly, highly intelligent, but also the psychology or the attitude of I can just lie and make this shit up, or believe that the fantasies or my imagination are the truth, and then go convince people of it, including channeling, right? Like
Mhm.
she was one of the first or the first to really promote this ascended masters and then channeling of the ascended masters,
Yeah.
which has become so normalized. And, you know, like when I got into New Age, I was like, oh, there's just this thing called the Ascended Masters. Oh, there's this thing, the Akashic Record. I guess they exist because apparently a bunch of authors on the New Age shelf say they do.
Mhm.
And they all give, vague answers to where it came from. And then to be like, no, 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 no. Blavatsky's the first one to say ascended masters and they're like this and I channel them. And then everybody took it and just perpetuated the story. But they're they're all just stories like the round table. They're
Yeah.
stories that somehow we then invest with. We just think that it's factual or we think it's real without any evidence. And then we get mad at you if you try to disprove it.
Yeah. Absolutely. The Blavatsky book was The Secret Doctrine, her final book in 1888. And it did. It's been analysed. There's a guy called K. Paul Johnson who actually worked out who the Ascended Masters were, that she was actually talking to particularly Italian Freemasons who would then actually set up the Risorgimenti so that the king and the senior members of this, they were Freemasons, just as in fact were the founders of the United States.
Right.
Many Freemasons among them. So you have this set of teachings that she is evidently breaking the rules. With the Freemasons, you're going to cut your tongue out and hang you upside
Right.
down and all of this kind of stuff. She released their secret teachings, but when you chase back their secret teachings, there are always the same claims made. Things will go back to the Book of Thoth and the Emerald Tablet, these mythological Egyptian texts, which
Okay.
Aleister Crowley tries to reconstruct the Book of Thoth, saying that it is, it's recorded in the tarot pack,
Right.
which is an interesting piece of nonsense. And fundamentally, when you trace back, you hit a point just after 1600, and that's it. These people are claiming, oh, it goes back. And it's a fraud that's been reperpetuated. It will always go back to Egypt for some reason. Why the
Yeah.
Sumerians don't get a look in, I don't know. It's just unfair because our culture actually does come
Right.
more from them. But these same claims will be made. In the early Renaissance, you had the Hermes Trismegistus and this idea that they'd found this genuine ancient, and it's a fraud.
Right.
In the 19th century, you have Ossian, the Scottish poet who inspired all sorts of musicians to write pieces. It's a fraud. And it enters history as if it were real, as if there really is. You see, I was told this secretly by my teacher who got it from, and it comes all
Right.
the way from Moses,
Right.
who said, don't tell anyone. And how are you going to prove or disprove this idea? Well, how you prove or disprove it is you look back to those civilizations and you say, well, what happened to them? If they had all of these superpowers, what became of them? Why were the Tibetans driven out by the Chinese? How were the Tibetans driven out by the Chinese if they have these superpowers? We now, in fact, the Tibetans are saying they used to have 5,000 tulkus, reincarnated masters. They lost
Wow.
3,000 of them, they reckon, since 52 or
Right.
whenever it was that they were shoved out. When you look at these things directly, they're absurd. And they're absurdities that are promoted. And for me, the essential thought, and it's a thought that's attributed to Voltaire, though he did not say it,
Yeah.
people who believe absurdities can commit atrocities.
Right.
And we start behaving in a different way. So the story, harrowing story you tell of your grandma, the idea that somebody is judged in this way and they're therefore subnormal. all of this, the racism, the misogyny, um, uh, all of the kind of, well, we're better than you are sort of nonsense that human beings have. Let's cut it back to the origins. We are all descended from black people.
Right.
That's a genetic fact. So some of us are paler than others. And the difference between us is the color of our skin, the color of our hair, and the color of our eyes. The rest, pretty much the same from one population to the next, certainly in terms of our intelligence. One of the greatest sociologists, Du Bois, happened to be black. He also was a racist. He believed in eugenics, but he was a black guy. And when you read him, he's fantastically perceptive. But he got caught up, as did D.H. Lawrence and H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill. All sorts of people got caught up. Most recently, Richard Dawkins, the eminent biologist, a few years ago said, well, of course, if you can do it to horses and dogs, you can do it to people. And you go, you're a biologist. You must understand that single trait hybridization won't work. You'll end up with dogs with pushed in faces and brain cases that are too small, like the King Charles Spaniel. We cannot breed human beings. And there's a proof of it. And again, because, who wants to think about Nazi science? Oh, I do. The Nazis disproved Aryan race theory. They hundreds of thousands of cases of measurement, and by the end, they couldn't tell between what they called Mediterraneanoid and Aryan. They couldn't tell.
Right. And this was phrenology. They would measure everybody's skulls and nose and face, and they took all these dimensions, and they claimed that by having that data, they could tell something.
Fingerprints, blood types, ear shapes, you name it. So
desperately looking for evidence, wanting to believe, and then not actually even being able to prove their case.
No. And in the final analysis, they killed or sterilized 250,000 schizophrenics. And we only have statistics from Mannheim in Germany, which I do report in the book. There is a higher proportion of schizophrenics in Mannheim, so in a place that was purged, than in 11 countries that it's compared to. Far higher.
That's weird.
So you're dealing with a complex set of factors. You don't just inherit schizophrenia. There are hundreds of genes or alleles that are involved in this. As with intelligence, there are something like 4,000 genetic spots that are connected with intelligence. It's this simplistic idea where we can breed people. And D.H. Lawrence talked about, he'd be quite happy to execute people as they marched into the Crystal Palace to be gassed because they'd be grateful. And you're going, D.H. Lawrence, this guy who's one of the heroes of literature.
Right.
So people become persuaded of absurd ideas, and they're then likely to do absurd, atrocious things.
And there's a one of those ideas that I don't remember when you brought it up in the book. There's something, so going back to Bruce and his worldview based out of, this path through Blavatsky, through Alice Bailey. We can loop back to her in a second. But in it comes this kind of relativism where there is no good and no bad. So if you were at the highest spiritual whatever, then you have this, can you unpack that a little bit? Because I ran into that and it scared the shit out of me.
Yeah, and it's a repeated idea. I mean, Ron Hubbard said, goodness and badness, beautifulness and ugliness are alike considerations and have no other basis than opinion. And that is put forward as an axiom, as a self-evident truth. It comes directly from Aleister Crowley, and it can be found, Nietzsche discussed it with a little more subtlety in Beyond Good and Evil. But it becomes, if you look back to the period of the Civil War in Britain in the 1640s, there was a group called the Doctrine of the Free Spirit. And they believed that because they had become Christ, they could do no wrong. and they therefore had to do things that were considered sinful by others to demonstrate they were beyond sin. And this is at the time of the Puritans. And the peculiar thing is, if they tried this under the monarchy, they would have been burned at the stake. The Puritans, curiously, were a lot more tolerant of this, and so they just locked them in prison for a week. But they'd go around naked, they'd have group sex, they'd, because they were beyond good and evil. They had achieved this. So you have this idea that, and it's so much what defines a cult. We are the elect. We are exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
As you're saying earlier, when somebody leaves a group, you kind of, well, we know the Moonies are a cult.
Yeah.
We know the Rajneeshis are a cult, but my
Right.
group, and we
No.
maintain that exclusivity. And that's why I wrote Opening Our Minds to say, this is not just true of all pseudo-religious, commercial therapy cults. This is true of political cults. This is true of gangs. This is true of radicalized terrorists. I use the example in Opening Our Minds of Omar Khan Sharif, who blew himself up in Israel, having been radicalized in this country, in England. And along the way, I found the recruitment manual that was being used by Al-Qaeda, and my jaw dropped because the method is the same as it is in Scientology or the Moonies or wherever you go. So the first point is you find somebody who you want to recruit and you never disagree with them. Whatever they say, however much you only pick on the things that agree with what you think. You then, of course, with the Moonies, it's called love bombing. You flatter them.
Right.
You tell them how
Right.
wonderful they are. Go through these things. In Scientology, you then find out what they think is the thing that's ruining their life. What's their ruin? And you say, we can deal with that, whatever it is. And I remember in Scientology being quite shocked at the thought that no matter what that ruin was, you'd offer them the same course. And which is a communication course, which is the training routines of Scientology, which when Steve Hassan first saw them, and there's nobody who knows more about this than Steve. He's a fully trained hypnotherapist. He's an Ericksonian trainer. When he first saw the training routines demonstrated, he said, "This is the most overt use of hypnosis I've seen in any cult." Most ex-Scientologists would say, "Oh, there are some good things in Scientology, and those training routines were quite useful." You're going, you didn't see what was happening to you. You didn't see that you were having a euphoric state induced.
Yes.
Firstly, by staring at things, or what is called meditation or mindfulness elsewhere. And I don't want to be too hostile here, but there are things that have been accepted in our culture without evidence.
Yes, and I really appreciate it because, I'm 52 now. I grew up in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. And, there's the witchcraft shop and there's the just the degree to which there's the beauty of being really open-minded and having a non-judgmental, compassionate nature. And that was a great.
Yeah.
And then there's the place where it's like, okay, but honey, where do you distinguish between reality and what's good for you and your own sense of orientation versus letting in all of this random crap basically? And that it's it's been a long process of deconstructing and questioning and being curious through the cults, and then of course just into childhood conditioning, the culture at the moment, the cultural influences that set us up. And for me as a young, insecure, curious person, and I think that this is part of it, is casting anybody who's going to bring a critical thinking or a skeptical eye, that they're hostile.
Yeah.
And they're not. That has been, and I even had that when I went into mediation with this group, and the president at the time, Rich Priddis, I made an impassioned thing and he was like, "Oh, you love Ista. You love it." And I was like, "Yeah, why would I be here fighting for something I didn't care about? You really think I dislike you enough I would do all of the work I've done to sit here?" And they really did. I mean, we were always the enemy. We were enemy number 2 or whatever out of the rankings. So there was never truly, goodwill or intention there.
No.
But that idea that even you look at Houdini or you look at so many, it's like, I love this enough. And if it's true, I want to know
Right.
it's true.
Right.
And that it isn't out of a malicious to take away your magic to, it's like, no, I love it enough to seek the truth.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
we haven't been able
Harry
to
Houdini wanted to communicate with his beloved mother who had died, and
yeah.
so he really did believe it when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he of Sherlock Holmes fame, said, "Well, my wife has channeled her," or and here is a
Yeah.
message from your mother. And that was the point where Houdini changed his mind about all this, because he looked at the message and he said two things. One, it has a cross at the top. My mother was Jewish. Point two, it's written in English. My mother didn't speak a word of English. You're making this up. And Houdini then set about exposing
Right.
the fraudulent nature of so much of this. And there is a confusion and a difficulty here. I am an agnostic. For me, that's the only point I can take, because I'm not clever enough to know stuff, and looking at what James Randi did and how he was able to pull the wool over any psychic's eyes and get
Mm.
the people he trained on several occasions absolutely approved as brilliant psychics when they were performing tricks. Derren Brown with his Messiah, when he was unknown in the US, only known here, he was approved by all but one of the psychics that yes, he can do remote viewing. Yes, he can read minds. Yes, he can do whatever. He's done table turning. He's done reading on slates that were sealed.
Yeah.
You see him do these things. Now, the point is not that I am an opponent of these things or a disbeliever in spiritual ideas or phenomena. I'm an agnostic. Jesus, when Thomas said to him, "I don't believe it's you," and that's a weird thought. You've been studying with the guy for a few years and you don't recognize him. That's kind of
Yeah.
weird. But he doesn't say, "Well, you're going to hell." He says, "Put your finger in the hole." Well, it's probably in his
Yeah.
wrist, actually. Put your finger in the hole. The
Right.
doubting Thomas is a permitted idea within Christianity. And yet it becomes this, you're now, that's about the rigidity of belief. So if I
Mhm.
talk about, let's go to meditation, because I've already said something rude about it, so I'll keep going. Staring at stuff. I learned Zazen in a Zen monastery when I was 18 years old. Sounds very romantic. It wasn't. It was up in the north of England. It was freezing cold. But it was an incredible experience. It was a life-changing experience. And the first thing it changed was I intended to be there for 6 months, and I left after 3 days. And it was the right thing to do, because I'd been hit by this incredible experience. In the first day learning this technique, I'd seen that I had 4 layers of linguistic thought going on in my head, or wherever
Oh.
they were going on, actually. Might have been but there were 4 clear layers that, by resting and letting this, and that was a great thing to see, to understand that what
Ah.
was being called the unconscious mind wasn't. It was all happening too quickly for us to notice. So that was useful. That's always been useful. I spent a year practicing meditation within the Soto Zen community. Which was a teacher down in Cornwall after being up in Hexham in the north. Now, so I don't decry meditation, but let's move forward a little bit. I carried on meditating. I do not use passive meditation as a form. I don't think it's a good idea to stare at a blank
Yeah.
wall, because what you're looking at is the feedback in your own brain,
Yeah.
what's called the Ganzfeld effect. So if you sit somebody in a completely dark room, within
Yeah.
10 minutes, they will start to hear noises. There aren't any noises. It's the brain turning up the sensitivity. And at that point, you can start imagining pretty much anything you want, and
Right.
channeling and all of this, the Jay-Z night sort of, I am now talking in a funny voice.
Right.
You can go wherever you want. We now move forward to mindfulness.
Yeah.
A few years ago, a New Scientist, a magazine I subscribed to for more than 30 years, because I want to know what's happening in the world, and it's reasonably good. They started promoting mindfulness. And I sort of went, let's hang on a minute here. This is meant to be a scientific magazine. Miguel Farias at Oxford University, who's the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Meditation, is a mindfulness meditator himself, had his graduate students at Oxford University, one of our most prestigious universities, gather together all of the evidence they could find for meditation, and they gathered more than 3,000 studies. They then checked through them as to whether they met the criteria for a scientific study. I think 36 of them did. That's all. They were all small studies, none of them large enough. All sorts of claims are being made. In fact, at Oxford University, you can study mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And the great Ruby Wax studied it there. The wonderful comedian Ruby Wax studied it. She is bipolar. New scientists should have been a little bit more careful before promoting something by somebody in a hypomanic state, because her own tutor at Oxford said, we still don't have enough evidence for this. But it's now all around the world. It's like, we've proved this, and this is what it does.
Right.
So you have Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's made a fortune selling this, and you have Daniel Goleman from Harvard, who should be ashamed of himself, because he does have scientific credentials. Because let's look at the parallel that we should be looking at that is obvious. In 1868, the Meiji took over Japan. The Meiji era began. The Zen schools, and they were already split, the Soto, the Obako, the Rinzai, and their sub-schools, they can't agree with each other. That's an interesting point. Yeah. They all wanted the favor of the Meiji, and so they started training the military. The enslavement of Okinawa, the enslavement of Korea, and they were enslavements, the invasion of Manchuria, Manchukuo, were all by soldiers who every day were practicing mindfulness. And yet we have Jon Kabat-Zinn and Daniel Goleman saying, to achieve compassion, all you need is mindfulness, the seventh of the 8 parts of the Buddhist Eightfold Path. You don't need the other parts. Well, the Japanese army performed the Nanjing Massacre. 400,000 civilians, the largest massacre since Genghis Khan in the 13th century. The Zen master, whose pupil had actually ordered this, wrote to the commander and said, you have brought true Buddhism to China by killing 400,000 people. Those soldiers meditated every day. So in and of itself, the idea that just by staring at something for 2 20-minute periods every day will bring you compassion. No, they were taught alongside that the doctrine of emptiness. You are nothing. I am nothing. It doesn't matter if you kill me.
And it doesn't matter if I kill you.
Yeah.
And that goes back kind of to there's no good, there's no bad, because
you're all part of Buddha mind, or, Maya, or whatever term you want to use. There are ways of sidestepping the fundamental, and the fundamental is very simple. We should have fellow feeling. We should have compassion for all members of our species. It makes sense, but it also is the only way that you can be happy in this world. If you have contempt towards your fellow human beings, you will never be happy. What's more, we therefore have to regard the symbiotic elements, all of the other creatures that live inside us and around us, everything that we depend upon. And so whatever is destructive, whatever is hateful, will lead to atrocious and awful behavior. It's so simple. And so many religions are about hating.
And they sell love. They sell love.
That, yeah.
I mean, that's, and it's learning for me. My friend put it as like, people say all kinds of things and you seem to believe their mouth noises, Cara. And I was like, well, I guess I need some discernment, right? Because some mouth noises very helpful. Other mouth noises should be ignored.
We call them words.
Yes. Except she's like, well, when they're all galaxy talk or, soup, what are all of our terms for nonsense that, gurus use, galaxy, where they just go wandering and you're supposed to follow, or you're supposed to, try to make sense of it. Again, back to that kind of fantasy state of, I have a great imagination. discerning between my imagination and reality is a huge part of the struggle. And that's part of what's been really manipulated, because I do have this state, and the misunderstanding that we can, certain practices like large group awareness trainings, where you have psychological pressure, whether you're with your guru staring at a wall for 5 hours, if they put you in a closet, like you will have, it is a normal response to that stimuli to have ecstatic or transcendent or religious or whatever you want to call it. And so, I mean, a big piece for me was like, and I think for a lot of young people, is you have this ecstatic experience and you want to keep it and you think it's better than everything else. And then you chase it, right? And then you're hooked by the guru or the cult or the thing. And that when you're in that ecstatic state or the states around it, we're incredibly vulnerable to taking in ideas, content being imprinted. You know, we really use brainwash, but I'm like, oh, when I was in that open state, you put in all kinds of ideas that I did not have the critical thinking, the presence to filter out. And then going down 3 months, I find these ideas in my head that I don't remember being like, oh, I actually believe this, or I have chosen this reaction to this content. For example, being like, oh, well, don't believe any of the people that had a bad experience. That's just them not being advanced enough or not ready, or they're in their negative, or they're in their shadow, or all the excuses, right? To not look at the criticism, as if we can't discern for ourselves what's worthy and what's not.
Yeah. And I mean, there are certain really fundamental ideas. The first is, for me, that our perception is very limited. If you compare our hearing to that of a dog or a cat, or our sense of smell, they're pathetic. If you compare our eyesight to that of an eagle, it's rubbish. We don't have good perceptual systems. So we don't actually experience reality in its fullness. That's the first thing. If you talk with neuroscientists, they'll say, well, an amoeba is the only thing that does experience reality, and it hasn't got a brain to think about it, because that takes us to the next sense, the next part, which is our interpretation. And I'm told that Kant, and he's way beyond my pay grade, I'm told that Immanuel Kant said that although we all live in the same world, we each of us actually live inside our interpretation of the world. That really hit home with, it keeps coming back to me, that somebody else can inevitably interpret reality for us. And that's what our religions are doing. One of the things that really got me last year, the Hubble telescope found 10,000 galaxies. 10,000 galaxies. We're averaging 100,000 million stars per galaxy. It found 10,000, right? Last year, the James Webb telescope got to probably its limit, 780,000 galaxies. Now, our sun is a tiny star, 100,000 million stars each in 780,000 galaxies. And the God that we worship, is worshipped in the Abrahamic religions. I'm rereading Robert Graves and Raphael Patai, the Myth of Genesis, where they take apart not only the book of Genesis in its various versions, but also early commentaries upon it. And there's this beautiful commentary, a midrash or something in the Jewish tradition, where God has decided that he's not going to nail down the northern part of the firmament of the heavens over the earth, because this is a challenge to see if any of the other gods is able to do it. I'm kind of going,
Other gods.
Well, sadly, the first commandment is the admission there are other gods. You shall have no other gods before me. That means there are others.
There are other gods.
Many other gods are named in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Baal is the one that we've all heard of, the golden calf. And he, in fact, is Jehovah's brother, which you can find in Babylonian texts. We now have the original text. These stories have been changed and interpreted to mean very different things. So the original Eden story, or an earlier Eden story, which goes back 1,500 years before the first possible Hebrew scripture, 1,500 years, is that Adam and Eve are being welcomed into the garden, not expelled. They're being welcomed by the snake, who is the father god, to pay homage to the mother goddess. And they're being given dates because apples were not known in that part of the world. They come from Afghanistan originally, I'm told. So that story then is changed to mean something, to make something else happen. Well, if there is a God, then God is not the God of this teeny little planet nailing down the firmament. There are 780,000. How dare I suggest that I have the vaguest understanding of something that enormous, that wonderful.
That's it for part 1 of 2 with Jon Atack. Thanks for listening. Our theme music is Midnight Rendezvous by Sasha Ende. If this helped you sort glitter from gold, I hope you'll come back. And I'd love to hear from you at foolsgoldpodcast@proton.me.